Hey everybody, it's Rory from A&S Gear, and today we're going to learn how to do some general maintenance on your paintball markers. Alright, so today we're going to look at a TMC. So this is the Tippmann carbine that is either magazine fed or hopper fed, either way you want to do it. We're going to pull it apart, look at the insides, and just point out basic maintenance features that you might need to look at while servicing or repairing a gun like this. So obviously it's going to be easiest to work with this with all the parts off of it. So we're going to take the front shroud off, and we're going to get all the other accessories off. You're going to have your feed neck here. It's tough to say which one you might be using in your gun or your setup. Either your standard feed neck here or the adapter plate, which kind of works as a cover so that you can use the mag fed system. Remember with this gun, if you're using the hopper system, you must be using the magazine that has the dummy top to it, has the ball detent here. And if you are using the mag feed system right here, you must use this top or this plate that has the detent system in it. So either one, you must be using the appropriate part. Now if you need to replace the detent, in this one right here, there is a little clip that holds the detent in place right there. You just slide that out and replace your detent. If you need to replace this one inside here, this one is a little different. You need to take apart the magazine. So we need to pull out the two screws on the side, and the detent is a very different shape than the standard Tippmann detent. So make sure you're buying the appropriate one. You can see that it's actually like a very large square block with the detent sticking off of it. So make sure you're getting the right one. All right, that being said, we can get that out of the way and we don't have to worry about that anymore. Get all the parts out of the way. Now I do still have over here this magazine right here. We'll take this one apart later and we'll show you how to clean it or what to look for, just so you can service these. And that will happen. You will get it dirty. It will need to be cleaned, so you will have to pull it apart. It's pretty simple on the inside. But for starters, let's take apart the gun. Let's get the sight off of here. I can pop that one off of there. Put that screw back in so I don't lose it. Let's take the front shroud assembly off. Now the shroud assembly, the front one, has a pin that comes into here. It's just a stabilizing little spot, and then it also has an Allen key. A screw. You would use an Allen key to get it out. So let's kick that. We will need to pull the screw all the way out for a second, and then we can undo the barrel. And then we can slide the shroud off the front. Gonna wiggle it out until it comes off. Now, here's that index pin right there, and then the pin that has the screw that goes through that. So it's gonna go like that through there. And this just keeps it from wobbling back and forth. But it is important that you take that off, or if you're not using it, at least you'll have to remove this screw out of there so that it doesn't get lost. All right, so now let's start pulling things apart. We'll save that for later. Let's go ahead and take these top ones out. That one is a little off size. I always kind of line up my screws in the order that I take them out for stuff that has different length screws that go in certain spots. I'll make a top row, a middle row, a bottom row for stuff I take out the top, the middle, the bottom, however it needs to be, so that when it comes time to put everything back together, I know exactly where everything goes, especially if you're using screws that come in multiple lengths for different sections of the gun, and you're not, you haven't done it a billion times where you know which screw goes where. Now a lot of that can come in handy obviously down the road, but if you knock all these over because you don't have enough workspace, then it doesn't do you any good anyway. So we've got one more there, which I need this for. This is too small. Let's try this one. There we go. Take that one off of there. Now make sure you don't lose any of these nuts. As you're pulling apart screws, everyone's going to have a nut on the back side of it. So make sure you don't lose any of those. Otherwise, when you go to put your gun back together, it's not going to be able to be tightened down. But they will just fall out sometimes, so do be careful. All right, so we get our grips off of here. And you can see as we pull our grips off, that allows our ASA at the bottom down here to just pop off. So the ASA is held in place by the grips, like that. So there's no screw or anything until you put the screw through the side there that holds it in place. But there's a little notched set for the ASA to fit inside of there. And then at the bottom down here, inside, down about right about here, inside there, there's an O-ring. And that O-ring is going to go around the tube and seal the ASA to the air passage tube that goes through the gun and up into the valve assembly up there. All right, let's move on a little further here. Now, as I'm pulling things apart, I'm just very careful when I'm taking them out, moving them around, that I'm not losing anything or dropping anything. I can see that the valve assembly is trying to pop up and come out of the way. Just because the trigger is stuck to it. There we go. Typically I would want to try to keep all the stuff down below so that it doesn't get crazy and jump apart on you. Let me just kind of set this all back up inside of here. And that's going to go right there, and then we'll talk about how it kind of sets up in a minute. Now, stuff that's on this side right here, we've got our mag release, which is right here. You can pull that out and clean it if you need to. Typically, you can just leave it in there because it just passes right through. You don't need to pull it out of there. You can if you want to. You could take it out and clean it. Pretty sure this just unscrews off of here. If you wanted to completely remove it. But until it is out like it is right now, until this half of the receiver is off, you can't unscrew this part because it is held in place by the other half. Like that. But unless there's a reason for you to be taking it apart, just leave it in there. Doesn't need to come apart. A lot of things when you're working on paintball guns where you don't need to do it. You can do it, but you don't necessarily need to do it. All right. Looks good. Everything kind of lined up. Make sure that it still has its springiness, and then we'll move on to the next part. All right, now for the trigger assembly switch right here, again, another thing that I don't recommend you take apart. There's no real reason to take it apart. If you needed to, very hard to see, but at the base of this part down here, there is a C-clip that holds the post in place, which then, you know, holds the outside in place. If you wanted to take this piece out, you would have to pop this C-clip off of the post, and then the whole thing would drop out the other side. But remember that there is a bearing that sits underneath this plate right here, and it's what locks it into its two positions right there. So if you pull this whole thing off, be very careful that you don't lose that bearing that is underneath there. All right, now we've got our cocking lever, which is right here. Now this part is going to go inside here, and when you pull this back, it's going to slide back and cock this back right here, which right now the gun is in a cocked position. And you can see that the hammer assembly right here is actually going back into the buffer tube back here. So that's just kind of a way the gun is different than you would see it in a 98 Custom or an A5 or something like that, just in where the parts are set up and how they're positioned inside there. So let's go ahead and pull the rest of it out. Oh, I forgot to put this part in there. That's our linkage arm right there. This is so when you pull the trigger, it activates the trigger assembly back here, pushes on the sear, drops that out of the way. So let's get everything out and go from there. So let's pull the linkage arm back out. We'll pull the trigger spring. Be careful we don't lose this trigger spring right here. It does like to kind of just shoot out if you're not careful. We can rotate our hose up and out of the way. We can actually probably pull this out at this point too. Again, there's just another O-ring in this fitting right there that helps it seal. Make sure that we don't lose our trigger pin. This pin right here goes through the trigger. We don't want to lose that. There's our trigger. Our trigger grouping at the back side. Again, it has another pin in it as well. I should flip this over so you can see it. Here's our trigger pin right there. Our trigger grouping, another pin, and another pin. So these pins are important as to limit travel, to create the pivot point for certain things. So we definitely don't want to lose any of those. And if we do, our gun's not going to work properly without them. So let's get this group out of here. And a lot of times when you pull something out, the pin will come with it. So replace your pin, put it back in there when you're done. Here's our sear assembly. Now right now, the gun is cocked back. It's under load right now. So I want to release that spring pressure. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold on to the hammer back here, and I'm going to move the sear out of the way so that the hammer can slide forward. I just want to be careful. Obviously, you don't want to crush my fingers or anything like that. So that comes forward. Now you can see that right there. Now I can remove the sear spring, and it is a different color and a different size than the trigger spring. I can remove the sear. Don't want to lose my sear pin. Put that back in there. And then I can start pulling out all my other parts here. So I can rotate this part right here without rotating anything else. I can pull that, my linkage arm out, my bolt out, my power tube assembly out, my hammer, or I think they might call it the striker, out. I don't know what they call it. And then my spring guide and my buffer O-ring. This is normal to have it just floating around inside of there, this little disc. On certain guns it's a big large O-ring, on certain ones it's a smaller O-ring. that it should just float right there. It does not need to be, or it does not go in like a specific groove or anything like that. It's normal for it to sit right there. Excuse me. So that's it. That's the inside taken apart right there. Clean it all out, wipe it down. The rest of the gun here, I don't want to pull this fitting out right here because it is Loctited in place, and I would have to re-Loctite it. But again, inside of this fitting, there is an O-ring. It is green, just from factory, and that is what seals the hose, this stainless steel line right here, inside there. If you needed to remove the valve, you could unscrew this out. I don't think I will be able to, 'cause I'm pretty sure I don't have one that's big enough to get that out of there. But to get to the valve assembly, you have to remove this out and then pull this piece out of there, and you could get that out of there. Because this is threaded in, it won't rotate. I don't even know why I tried to unscrew this off of there, because it won't come off. It's this fitting threads into the valve body, which keeps this from moving around and coming out. So without removing this, you can't remove this out of there. But if you needed to replace the valve or rebuild the valve, that's how you would get that out of there. And that's our velocity adjuster right there. By threading this screw in, you are limiting the amount of air or volume of air that can pass through and come out the end of the gun. It just reduces velocity. It's a very simple design by just blocking airflow to create a lower or higher velocity. All right, so I mean, that's it. The majority of the leaks that you're going to have in a gun like this are not leaks, issues with function are this O-ring right here, which is going to cause the gun to potentially not cycle or sputter or not fire, really. So replace that on there. If this whole section up in here is dirty, so where the hammer needs to slide back and forth inside of there, or up in here where the linkage arm sits, if it's really, really heavily caked in dirt or old oil or old grease, it can slow the whole system down and it will cause it not to work. But if you get in and clean it, replace the O-ring or re-grease the O-ring if it's not bad, I mean, the gun is very, very hardy, and you shouldn't have really any other issues in that. You might get issues with hose leaking. You replace the O-rings on the hose. If you get a valve leak from like right here, you might need to re-Teflon or re-Loctite this fitting and put it in the valve. But very, very straightforward, very easy solutions to the problems that are presented to you here. So let's go ahead and reassemble everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my spring in, and I'm going to look down inside here because there's a hole that these pieces will fit into, and I want to make sure that it goes in there. Can't really see it because this little ring is in the way. And this little piece that fell out right there is just a little plug for the back of the gun. Just fits right in there. So if it does fall out, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You know where it goes. This one's gonna fight me. I can feel it already. That in there. Let's go ahead and get our bumper on there so that we don't get any problems. Put our hammer in, striker, hammer, whatever you want to call it. I think they might even call it a back bolt or something like that. Put our power tube assembly in, and then we're good from here. It's going to be a little bit easier. Now, one thing I didn't mention is on the hammer, there's a slot cut in the bottom of it right here. You can see it right down there. The sear needs to fit into that slot, so make sure that you have that in the appropriate orientation so that the sear can fit into it. Otherwise, if that's not set up properly, the sear can't ride inside of it and it won't catch properly. There's no room. You won't be able to put the gun back together if you don't put that together right. All right, so from here we can put our linkage arms back together, and let's rotate. So we're going to rotate the hammer like we did right there so that the linkage hole arm, or a linkage arm hole, is not laying vertical with the plane of the gun, but it's kind of standing up so it's easier for me to put it in. I'm going to take my bolt, I'm going to slide it on, and I'm going to take my arm and I'm going to just connect the two, there and there, and then I'm just going to rotate it back over. It's the easiest way to do it right there. So you're not trying to fit this thing in there and snap it down in. You just put it together and call it a day. All right, so from here, this can move back and forth. We can test this to make sure that it's moving the way it should. If you don't hold these pieces down and you could try to compress this, it's just going to go boing and shoot out. So be careful. Let's get our whatchamacallit back together. Our cocking handle. Now you see what I did here? In order to get this cocking handle to function properly and move back and forth the way it's supposed to, you have to compress the spring down first, or compress it out of the way. As you can see, the spring, it wants to ride all the way up to the very front of the charging handle. If you try to put this in, there's a notch cut right here. It might be hard to see, but there's a notch right there. This notch fits over this little bracket that they have put on the linkage arm right here. So that when you pull this back, the linkage arm bracket is in the notch and it grabs it and it pulls the whole assembly back and cocks it back. If you just try to put this in like this, you can see that the spring right here doesn't want to fit through this little gap that they've created for you, which is for the guide rod. So we have to put this in, make sure we line up our notch with our little linkage arm catch there. So we're lined up. We can see that this is kind of sitting up at a funny angle right there. So now we have to pull the spring forward and out of the way and let that drop into place. And then the spring is actually going to rest against that little pass hole right there, so that when we pull it back, the spring, oops, try to do this so you can see it. When I pull this back, the spring compresses rather than just slides back with the charging handle. All right, so that's taken care of. Let's go ahead and reassemble our trigger. First thing we need to do is put our gas line in. So we're just going to push that into place. Make sure that if you've pulled it out and cleaned it, that you re-grease or re-oil the O-ring on the inside of the fitting, just so that it makes a good seal. And also, when you're putting this in, make sure you're pushing straight in. You don't want to be tilting this at an angle and potentially cutting or damaging the O-ring that is inside, because then you will get a leak issue. All right, so we're just going to put that in there for now, like that. Good. So let's go ahead and I bet you we could put this on here like that. You cannot put both pieces together right now, just because the cover has to fit underneath this one, so it will be in the way. But I'm going to leave it off, because really it's going to make it even more difficult, I think, to line everything up. All right, so let's get our trigger in. The first thing we're going to do is drop our trigger in. And our trigger, this part of our trigger, needs to pass underneath our gas line. So I kind of just rotated the gas line up. I'm going to take my trigger and drop it into place. Make sure that it goes through our trigger pin right there. And then I can rotate the gas line back down. And before we finally assemble everything, we're going to take one final look over and make sure that everything's in the right spot, because it will shift and move as you're trying to assemble things. All right, so take our trigger group here, drop it down, make sure that it sits securely where it's supposed to. Take our trigger spring, put that up on our trigger. And now, one thing I will point out, in this setting right here, as the gun is set up, you can see that our trigger arm, which comes underneath here and is over here, is actually, it's blocking the hole, if I can do this without dropping anything, the hole right there, so right there, that's the hole that our safety fire switch is going to pass through. It is in the way. So when we install this, we're going to need to pull the trigger to move that arm right here out of the way of the hole so that the safety lever, safety post can fit through the hole. Otherwise it will just get jammed and it will not go through. So it's one thing we'll need to remember when we put it back together. So we'll drop our sear in, put our sear spring in like that, and then our linkage arm to go between the two. There we go. All right, so now we're going to do one check across, make sure that everything is seated properly. Everything looks good right there. All our springs are in place. This isn't weird and bowed or bent out of position. I want to line up this because it needs to pass through this oval, so where we use the mag release button, I don't want it to be like this because it will not fit through. It needs to be vertically oriented, almost said orientated, so that it fits through the hole right there. And remember our linkage system right there. And then this little bugger always comes out when you least expect it. There we go. So I'm going to kind of hold this up at an angle so I can see in here what's going on. I'm going to try to slide everything in, line it all up so that it will go back together. Pull the trigger, drop that piece down in there. I'm going to look around to see if I have any gaps, if I have anything like sticking up or not going together. That will give you a good indicator that it's not properly together. Everything looks okay. So now I'm going to take my top two screws, I'm going to put them in so that I know it will hold together for the moment. I think that nut fell out. Yeah, it did. So I'm going to make sure that that lines up properly. Again, if you're going to flip a gun over like that, be very sure that you've got a hold of it from both sides so that it doesn't come apart on you while you're moving it. All right. So now I know that I'm less likely to have this thing split open on me right now. So I'm going to go ahead and put the bottom on. I'll set that there. I'm going to take my trigger. Actually, before I set that on there, I'm going to take my ASA, put that on there. Now I'm going to put this on. That way I can adjust the height of this where it needs to sit. Put that on, and then I'm going to put my screws back in. 1, 2, and 3 for now before we put this one in on the other side. Let's tighten these 3 down. Get out of there. All right. Okay. Now, going left to right here. So this one is the long one that locks that in place, which I guess we can put on right now. Seeing though we are going to put it back together. Take this, put that back on there. Put that there. I'm not going to tighten this all the way in, just enough to keep it from coming out. And then our last two lower receiver screws. And then that's our gun. So our gun is back together, except for this one. Done and done. So that's your gun right there. But the gun without the magazine, especially if you're using MagFed, could be pretty useless. So let's pop this thing open real quick and just look at that, and then we'll be all set and done with it. So it's got a couple different components to it. It's got the lower section here, the upper section, and then it has a little retainer clip that sits right here, which you'll have to slide off. So I pulled this off first. That's the bottom. Now when you do this, you pull the bottom off like that, it's going to let the spring kind of stick up. Now this spring is going to go all over the place when you take the whole thing out. So don't worry, it's pretty easy to manage, but it is not going to just stay in this nice little arc. It's going to come out and go all over. So just be prepared for that. Secondly, we're going to take these two out. I guess if you had some debris that had collected at the bottom down here, or some paint or something, you could clean it out just the bottom section. But if you need to get all the way into it, this is what you're going to do. All right, so those three are out. This piece will come off only when we remove this little silver clip at the bottom down here. So typically you can just grab it and slide it up. Sliding it off is much easier than sliding it back on. It shot right off of there. And there we go. It's just a little, like, I don't want to call it a C-clip, but just kind of a little crimp there. Now at this point we can take this section off. Now I do recommend that as you take this off, hold this wheel down and lift this all up. Don't worry about the spring. It's going to get crazy on you. And then what I'm going to do, you can see right here, I'm going to put my finger underneath and I'm going to hold this spring in place. And I'm going to lift my hand off here. I'm going to show you guys what this looks like before it all comes apart, so that you can kind of get an idea of what it needs to look like when putting it back together. The top case we just pulled off doesn't have anything in it. You will see some grease up around this wheel, this hole up here. That's where your feeding wheel, or the loading wheel that pulls the spring around sits and rotates. So they grease it up so that it spins freely. From here we can take the spring and wheel out. So we're just going to let the spring kind of do what it wants and pull the wheel out. Okay, now you can see that this thing is all sorts of crazy curly-cued. So when we put it back together, it's, you know, we kind of have to line it up and fight it a little bit to get it in there. It's not hard because it's not a very stiff spring, but we will need to do something with it. Now at the top here, you've got a couple sections. You've got the detent section and the release section for the wheel after you've wound it up. So both have a spring and both can come out. So this little spring on this side looks like this. It's a tiny, tiny little spring. It's right there. I don't want to hold it in front of my black shirt because it makes it really hard to see, but just a tiny little spring. And that just makes sure that this piece continually stays pushed up. So let's pull that out. You can see what that looks like right there. right there. Now, if you're wondering, where do I put this, how do I put it back in, or where does it need to go? It has a little nub, a little button on the back side of it right there, and that's what the spring is going to push up against. So if you install this back in with the nub facing down or into the magazine, you cannot install it backwards. You put it in there because you know that the spring needs to push up against it. So if the nub is facing down, you're putting it in the right way. Once that's in, we're going to just take our spring and we're going to kind of just drop it in and set it down in there. And this does help with a little pick because the spring will want to kind of jump around. So I'm just going to kind of work it until we get it down in there. Again, this would be an area where you don't want to work in this with this kind of stuff, small springs and like the dirt or anything like that, unless you have no other choice. Nice wide open table where if you do have a spring that shoots out, hopefully you can find it, but try to be as careful as possible with your springs. Now this assembly right here has 3 pieces on it. It has the main lever, which runs up and down, the side lever, which runs over and pushes on the top of this, or the ball, whatever balls are in there, to keep them from feeding when the magazine is out. And then the spring, which sits right down in there. So the easiest way to do this is to pull the spring first. And I kind of just grab it with my pick and get it up out of the way and pull it out, and it is a much larger spring. And then we've got the 2 components, which will come out, our gate, and then the large post. So the post has a cutout for the spring. It's like a trough right there. So when you go to reinstall it, make sure that the trough is down inside the magazine. The gate itself has a rounded end, and then it has a end that has a point on it right there. The pointed end is going to go in. The rounded end is what's going to push up against the top of this. So we want to make sure our rounded side is out the top and our pointed side is at the bottom. The pointed side actually is going to work as a flat spot and help hold our spring in place. So once that's set up, I'm going to hold on to all the pieces so they don't go anywhere, and then I'm going to put the spring in this way. I'm going to come in from the top, put it into its little trough groove on the post, and take my pick and just kind of push everything into place so it's properly seated. All right, that's good. Now, it's always possible for these things to pop up and shoot all over the place, so be wary of that. Now, when we put this in, we need to do the same kind of thing we did with the charging handle spring as we do this. As you can see, the spring is pushing right up against the wheel here. And if we just throw this in like this, it will not work and you will probably break it. As you can see, the wheel is going to fit into this groove right here, and there's a divider plate right here. The spring needs to sit up against the plate. There is a wire that runs through the middle of the spring. You can see it inside there. The wire is going to pass through this notch right there, and then the wheel is going to sit up top. So let's go ahead and get that in there, and we'll show you how that sets up. So here we go. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is make sure my wheel is going in the proper side. One side has the knob that you're going to turn, and the other side has all the little ratchet stops on it. The ratchet stop side goes towards the bottom. So we're going to make sure that we have it face the right direction. We're going to line up the hole. So there's a post inside the hole, the wheel well here, which is going to go up inside the ratchet, or the wheel from the ratchet side. We're going to pull the spring back like that, and then we are going to drop the wheel in, and then we're going to make sure that our line goes into the groove, just like that. And now we can release the spring, and you see the spring is pushing up against the divider. Okay. At that point, we also want to make sure that our ratchet stop, which is this little thing that we pulled out earlier, is in between one of the stops, and it's not holding the wheel up at a funny angle. And all you need to do is just kind of wiggle the wheel back and forth, and you'll see, you'll hear it click. or you'll already notice that it's in the right spot. All right, so that's done. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna kind of hold this in place and hold this in place, just like this, kind of any way you can to keep it from going all over the place. Don't worry about the back end here. We're gonna take our cap or our cover or whatever you're gonna call it, and we're gonna put it on here. And then you can see that I've actually pinched this in here. That's why I didn't squeeze it or crush it or anything like that. I have to kind of readjust it. So I'm going to just open this one side enough where I can pull the spring back in, and then I'm going to close it again. Now when I was doing that, when I was lifting this side, I was keeping this side down still. So I was only kind of opening one edge as much as I could to keep that from wanting to come off of there. So at this point, we can put these two screws back in. So that the rest of this can't get away from us. All right. As you can see, this is not coming up to the top, which is fine. If I put my finger in there, it just pushes it down. That's because this spring really needs to be held into this configuration right here, like this, so that it does push up to the top. If I let go of the spring, it doesn't do anything. So I'm going to put this back to where it needs to be. It's going to sit like that. It's not going to lay nicely down in the little groove. It's going to sit up. So I'm just going to make sure that it's positioned close. I'm going to take this, I'm going to put the spring into this groove on this side, and then just push it into place. You want to make sure that that spring fits that groove, and you don't want to pinch it anywhere, because then when it tries to compress, when you go to turn this wheel and it starts pulling that string up and compressing that spring, if the spring can't move smoothly by itself, then it's going to have a problem. And then we can put our crimp back on the top. And this for me was actually the hardest part, trying to do it by hand. I'm sure you could get a little pair of pliers or something and get it on there, but there you go, that's on there. Now we're going to wind this up, make sure that it pulls that down. You can see it's going inside there. And then that's good, that's good. Release it, make sure it comes up to the top. Everything seems right inside there. All right, so that's our magazine right there. That is our TMC, Tippmann TMC. You're running it either mag fed or hopper fed, it's up to you. Hope that helps. Well guys, I hope this helps you out with any questions or concerns you have about your paintball gear or products. And as always, for all your paintball needs, shop ansgear.com.